The podcast you're about to listen to may contain random lines from musical theater, terrible attempts at regional accents, and a sincere discussion about mental health. You have been warned. Are you ready to start singing with your feet? Formidable! Allez, c'est parti! Non, nous ne sommes pas fous, nous ne sommes pas ivres, nous sommes juste dans la joie. Une joie profonde, nos cœurs elle inonde. Cette joie, elle vient du ciel. Non, nous ne sommes pas fous.
Welcome to Sing With Your Feet. My name is Lily Fields, and I'm going to be your fairy godmother for the next half hour or so. First and foremost, Cinderella, Happy New Year. I wish you much contentment, joy, and self-reflection this year. I hope that each of us will make progress in the littlest details of our lives, like a mosaic, each tiny little piece bringing the larger image into focus. It's the little things, Cinderella. It's the little things that will make all the difference. Contentment, joy, satisfaction, these are all choices that we make one tiny little tile at a time. If I sound a little bit geeky right now, it's because this week I am celebrating the 1-year anniversary of this little dream come true project, which is my podcast. This podcast was my reward for keeping my New Year's resolution back in 2021, which, if you've been following along, you may remember was to buy no clothes in 2021. That New Year's resolution seemed pretty simple on the surface. Just buy no clothes, right? Well, even something that sounds as simple as that comports dozens of little shaded areas, like learning how to darn a sock, or learning how to resist the desire for something new that has nothing to do with an actual need, or dealing with the deep-seated self-image problems that make shopping an easier fix than doing the heavy lifting of self-reflection. Dealing with our closet issues, while it may seem like an insignificant thing, a tiny little detail of life, it's the kind of thing we might even be embarrassed to admit that we spend real time thinking about and real money trying to improve, is the kind of self-reflection that I want us to undertake together. Anything that takes up that much of our 3 resources. Pop quiz. What are our 3 main resources? All right, time, right? Talent, okay, and treasure. That's right. Anything that takes up our time, our talent, or our treasure is no insignificant thing. So I was super excited to talk about it today, to start a whole series of episodes about our closet, our self-image, our attachment to clothes, and what some of these things might actually mean. And then Christmas came, and I knew I had to talk about something else first. So, while my intention had been to start digging into a most Cinderella and fairy godmother-worthy topic as a way to kick off the new year in style, so to speak, I'm going to have to put it off for another week to make way for, to make way for disappointment. You'll see. It'll make sense in a second. All that being said, thank you for being here, Cinderella. Thank you for your faithful listenership. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your participation in this project. I am super excited to be on this journey with you. I'm super duper excited to announce that this summer I will be visiting the USA with my merry band of scalawags, and we will be touring a bit in the Great Lakes region. I have already announced to my family that we will be making detours to meet Cinderellas, and I'm even thinking of hosting a little tea party in the Cleveland area so that we can get together in our very best dresses and talk about our ideal lives. Talk about joy, talk about fairy dust, and all the other fairy godmothery, Cinderella-y fodder that we can come up with. So if this sounds like something you might like to attend, shoot me a message on Instagram or by email, lily@singwithyourfeet.com. Since it's the beginning of the year, I need to ask you to do something for me, if you would be so kind. Could you return to the podcast platform on which you listen and give the podcast a 5-star rating and a review? And while you're at it, please, would you share the podcast on your social media? I'm most active on Instagram, but you can also find the podcast on Facebook too. You know, I don't like to do this self-promotion-y stuff, but it really does help grow our audience, and I believe in what we are doing here, and I think you do too. The more, the merrier on the journey to contentment, right? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, on with the show. This week's podcast is going to be largely anecdotal, and you'll have to forgive me for this, but I feel like the lessons I've been facing lately about disappointment are hugely universal, and I want us to catch this train early so that this time next year, when we come to be making our New Year's resolutions for 2024, we don't find ourselves left behind again. If anyone is to blame for the change in programming this week, it is my youngest child. My youngest is 5, almost 6 years old. He is, I don't know how else to say this, he is infuriatingly like me. Ever since he was tiny, he has been like an open book to me. His thought processes, his people-pleasinginess, his enthusiasm and charisma, the way he experiences love through specific kinds of touches. For example, he very specifically likes to have his back kneaded in an upwards gesture under the t-shirt with an exact kind of pressure. Do this right, and he will tell you that he knows you love him. It's like he has a love button right there in the middle of his back. He also has a wily, sneaky, snoopy streak and a very serious pent-up rage problem that comes from being a people pleaser. All these things are exactly like me, and raising a child who is an exact reflection of oneself is disconcerting to say the least. And it is also therapeutic. This year at Christmas, as you may remember, I encouraged you to find ways to give gifts that speak the love language of the people you're celebrating with. And I encouraged you to study the people you love, to consider what their gift receiver template would be. That is, do they enjoy quality or quantity gifts? Are they people who prefer surprises or anticipation, etc., etc., etc.? I also encouraged you to consider, according to what you know and could deduce about the things that they say and their behavior, to try to find ways to give a gift that would help meet their deepest need or their deepest want. Now, I may only have 5, almost 6 years of study under my belt when it comes to this kid, but I also have the knowledge that he is very much like me in many ways. So I feel like I am a doctoral candidate when it comes to giving gifts to this child. Just for fun, let me give you an anecdote about this child that you may enjoy. In 2021, so this is not this last year, but the year before, his French grandparents gave both this scalawag and his older brother advent calendars, but not the chocolate behind each window kind. Oh, no, no, no. The advent calendars contained little toys behind each window. The eldest scalawag received a Star Wars Lego advent calendar, and the littlest scalawag, who is the hero of this story, received a Paw Patrol figurine advent calendar. We had been visiting the in-laws, the aforementioned French grandparents, in November, and we managed to bring those advent calendars home in secret without the children finding out. As December crept closer and closer, the boys insisted on asking if they would be having advent calendars this year. I didn't tell them for a while, but finally, around, I'm going to say the 28th of November, I completely cracked and I told them. Of course, you may remember that my husband and I differ on one very important point when it comes to gift giving. He believes in surprises. I believe in anticipation. His reason is, what they do not know about, they cannot repeatedly ask about, thus promoting tranquility. My reason is that sometimes the best part of a gift is the anticipation of the gift itself. My husband was right on this occasion. The badgering he and I received about those advent calendars was not worth the trouble. And after 24 hours of non-stop harassment, we caved and we let them see what their advent calendars would be. But of course, seeing was not enough. No. Then they wanted to hold the calendars in their grubby little mitts. And then they wanted to just be allowed to study the boxes quietly in their rooms. The next thing I knew, I was making dinner in the kitchen, and everything was remarkably calm. As a matter of fact, I had gotten through the process of making dinner without ever once being interrupted, which I can unequivocally state had heretofore never occurred. I even got a chance to do the cooking dishes, to dry them, and to put them away. Talk about things being calm. Then I heard my littlest scalawag's door open. He padded quickly down the hallway. Then he peered his little head around the corner and said, "Mama, I need some Scotch tape." Scotch tape? That sounded a little suspicious. "What for, darlin'?" I asked. "Nothing." This was definitely suspicious. I got out the Scotch tape and tried to follow him back to his room, but he backed down the hall, hands at arm's length. No, don't come in," he said. Well, I did go in, and I discovered that he had opened up every single window on his Paw Patrol advent calendar, removed and studied every single figurine. Some of the windows had been accidentally ripped off. I'm fairly certain I didn't react well to this betrayal of the advent calendar code of conduct. I believe I muttered a few choice digs under my breath about how I should have known better and that he can't be trusted. And I carefully taped the advent calendar back together, having to create one door out of whole cloth because it had gotten lost somewhere in his room. And I removed the advent calendar from his reach. What I didn't have the bandwidth at that moment to understand was just how overwhelming his need to know was. This child loves to anticipate what is in his gift, and he simply has to know. He, like me, hates surprises. But I reacted so badly to his actions that I made him feel real shame about his need to know. And honestly, between you and me, there are so many other real things to feel real shame about that an advent calendar shouldn't be a first experience with shame. Now, should it? Not when he was just a tiny little thing and truly was just desperately curious and wanted to know. So when December 1st rolled around and we presented the somewhat cobbled back together advent calendars, this child quietly opened up the first window, which was indeed closed with Scotch tape, closed it back up, and pushed the calendar away, never touching the toy, and with an expression of deep embarrassment, shame, and what I have come to understand as the darkest emotion of the human experience: disappointment. Disappointment is a natural, universal experience. It comes from our hopes or expectations not being met. On a macro level, there are many reasons why we can feel disappointment, loss of any kind, but especially death, estrangement, loss of a job or income or relationship problems. These are easy to understand and easy to explain. Anytime we have an expectation or a dream and that is taken away from us, the emptiness that remains is disappointment. But disappointment isn't always so easy to identify or easy to explain. That emptiness can appear when we least expect it and can darken even the most joyful occasions. It can manifest as buyer's remorse when we finally obtain that thing we have wanted for so long, or a sense of unfairness even though we have received exactly what we hoped for, or a little sharp feeling of failure even in the midst of an immense success. If we were to actually articulate what we are disappointed about, it could seem very, very small and insignificant. Let me tell you another story about my youngest scalawag, which is the starting place for this week's episode. This year at Christmas, the one and only thing my youngest child asked for was science stuff. Keep in mind, he's not even 6 years old yet. I'm not entirely sure he knew what this meant. On the surface, it sounded like he was asking for a microscope. And if someone heard what he said and tried to translate it into a tangible gift, that's probably what he would have ended up with. But this child has a mother who is a student of the love languages and of the gift receiver templates. I knew, having observed him at length, that he had had a wonderful time this last summer with his Popeye, my father, and Grandma Daisy, doing a few simple at-home experiments with easy-to-obtain materials, and he wanted more of that. However, I also knew that the thing that interested my child was not necessarily the science experiment itself, which he would surely not remember much about. What he wanted was to recreate the special moments he had shared with people he loved, doing something that everyone kind of found fun. not to get too philosophical about it, but those little science experiments did create a sense of wonder in all the grown-ups involved. And wonder is something very powerful. Wonder is magical, and a child who is sensitive to the joy of others, aka a people pleaser, can feel quite powerful if he can stoke wonder in others. So, I understood that what my child was asking for was not just a microscope or a telescope. He wanted moments of connection with the grown-ups in his life in which he could feel powerful and make us all feel genuine joy. His deepest desire was for shared moments of joy. So, off I went to the toy store to pick up a box of shared moments of joy and a packet of power powder and a little baggie of wonder. And to my astonishment, such things do not exist. Although they should. I would be a billionaire if I could invent those. What we did find, both his indulgent father and I, plus his amazing Aunt Poppy and his grandparents, were science experiment kits for kids. Now, let me provide, in parallel, a comparison to this study, which is my eldest scalawag, whose one desire was for a pair of Bruder Dodge Ram pickup trucks, which would give him hours and hours of delight as he played independently with them, inventing and recreating entire worlds. He would be easy to buy for. His wants and deepest desire was for an object that would boost his creativity. His gift could be ordered on Amazon or found at a toy store, far more readily than his brother's. On the morning of Christmas, when the gifts were opened and the Dodge Rams were released from their gigantic wrappings, and the science experiment kits were opened from their rather modest-sized boxes, and it was understood that it would require adult supervision to help out with the science experiments, and no one was immediately available to help perform the experiments, well, disappointment set in. I eventually found my youngest child standing behind a door in a darkened room, quietly crying. I recognized the emptiness in his eyes. Well, I had known that his deepest desire was for connection and the feeling of power when he gave pleasure to others. He had understood that what he wanted was a science experiment kit, and now he was faced with the emptiness of not immediately getting what he wanted. The words he said were, "My brother's package was bigger." I do believe that the size of the package was a real source of disappointment, too. Comparison always leads to disappointment, no matter if we come out on top or not. But in many ways, he was trying to put words on a feeling that doesn't always make sense, because very often we don't bother or we don't know how to articulate our deepest wants and needs, and therefore we cannot recognize them when they are not met according to our hopes or expectations. I have been talking about a child faced with disappointment, but I want you to take a second and honestly consider if you have felt any disappointment lately. Our grown-up disappointments are often in proportion to how much joy we expected to get from an outcome. I like to call this the joy to disappointment ratio, and as geeky as that sounds, my reasoning is pretty sound. The more I expect any one thing to bring me joy, whether it is an existential desire like becoming a parent, or that another person can fill me up and make me feel whole, or that a gorgeous new lace-edged cashmere t-shirt can satisfy my need to feel beautiful, the greater the potential to feel disappointment. I'm going to give you two grown-up examples, one of which speaks of pregnancy loss, so I just want to prepare you for that. The first example, though, is from my very first employment experience after I graduated from college. I was working at Walt Disney World in Florida, giving tours to visiting school groups. As an intern, I led a filmmaking workshop and a history of animation class. I loved my job, but I really wanted to move into working in the guest relations department, and for those of you unfamiliar with the ways of Disney, this was kind of like the customer service department. I knew that this was how I could get into being a tour guide, which was what I really wanted to do. And if you've listened to the podcast before, you know that I did end up getting to be a tour guide. So yay, this story has a happy ending. But this story happened in the space between my internship and being hired full-time in guest relations. I got a call at home from a guest relations manager, a person who I would sometimes teach a workshop with. So he called and he said, "Hi, Lily, this is Derek. I have an opening in my department and I'm saving it for you. Get your application in by tonight." You cannot imagine how much joy I felt as I hung up the phone. This was the next step to my dream job. I remember so vividly standing in my bedroom on South Yalu Drive on that second floor looking out into the tree that was right there and the squirrels that were dancing in the tree. I literally felt like Cinderella, who had all of these little creatures celebrating with me. I remember 2 of them sitting on a branch, listening to me while I sang non-stop Mozart's Alleluia from the Exultate Jubilate. Time stood still. There was so much joy. I got my application in on that day. I had the job within 24 hours, and I started working within 48 hours. I still had no idea how much money I would be making because I was afraid to ask. I assumed that it would be more than I was making as an intern, and I knew people who worked full-time on that salary and had families, so I assumed it had to be a grown-up kind of paycheck that I would be bringing home, keeping in mind this would be my first real job after college. And then I remember finding out that I would be making barely more than I had been making as an intern. And suddenly I started to free fall from that precipice of joy that I had been twirling around on 48 hours before. My disappointment was all the greater because of the height of the joy that I had experienced. I had built up an idea in my head of what my salary would be and how I would be able to support myself and my husband more comfortably on it. And in just a moment, with one single-digit number, my dream had been torn to shreds. I was angry at myself and embarrassed that I had been so innocently joyful, and this only added to the disappointment. It was an impressive joy to disappointment ratio. Similarly, after several years of trying to get pregnant and finally getting a positive pregnancy test and finding out that we would be having not 1, but 2 babies, my husband and I found ourselves at the peak of dream-filled joy. We were floating above the clouds. We were full of hope and thankfulness and a sense of the miraculous and of wonder. I remember putting the song Happy on a loop for hours and dancing around to it. All of this would be destroyed only a short time later when we learned that our babies would not survive. The word disappointment cannot adequately describe that feeling. It was like plunging headfirst into a black hole. From this horrible, deep dive into disappointment, I discovered one profoundly painful truth. The greater the joy, the greater the risk for disappointment. And this joy to disappointment ratio is why lucidity is an absolutely crucial virtue. Lucidity helps us to manage our expectations and helps us to understand the deeper needs, dreams, hopes, and wants that are at play in our experience of joy. Joy does not come in a box or in a bundle or in a paycheck. Joy comes in knowing ourselves, loving ourselves, and understanding ourselves in spite of our circumstances.
Elle me fait bondir et vibrer, crier. Elle me donne envie de chanter, danser. Elle pousse à agir, donner, partager. Et tout simplement de sourire aimer.
This is all well and good, Littlefields, and even though I don't want to admit it because sometimes it makes me feel shallow, this topic does speak to me. So, what should I do when I feel disappointed? Oh, why, Cinderella, I'm so glad you asked. I have 2 sets of answers to that question. The first is short-term mitigation techniques for disappointment. The second set is a series of strategies for developing contentment, which is a natural antidote to disappointment. First things first, because we need to deal with the short-term impact of our disappointment, here are a few things you must not do when you feel disappointed. Number 1, do not berate yourself. If the disappointment is small, do not accuse yourself of being foolish or small-minded or silly. Disappointment is disappointment. Number 2, do not ignore your disappointment. As people pleasers, we are really, really, really good at ignoring our own feelings, especially the uncomfortable ones that we don't understand or we don't like. For once, acknowledge your feelings. Say the words, "I am disappointed." Number 3, do not bury your disappointment. Do not grin and bear it. Do not shove it away and pretend it wasn't there or that you never noticed it. Do not lie about your disappointment once you have noticed it. My mother always used to say, "Notice what you notice." I love this expression because depending on where we are in our lives, we experience the same things differently. This is, in many ways, why we can never go home again. We are always evolving and changing, and therefore what we notice and what we feel is evolving too. So noticing the trigger for our feeling of disappointment is really important. Notice how those feelings manifest. Are you just quietly folding the paper over a gift? Or are you hiding in a darkened doorway crying hot tears? Notice the feelings, notice your reaction, and notice your thoughts. I would suggest that when you are faced with an unexplained disappointment, it is important to get away by yourself for a few minutes. For one, it's not cool to have to explain our disappointment, especially when we don't fully understand it ourselves. For two, people don't like to see other people feeling sad, so they may try to cheer you up. You don't need to deal with someone else's idea of what they think you need. You need to understand your thoughts and feelings. So getting away from others so that you can concentrate on yourself is critical. As with all feelings, we need to be able to let the cycle complete itself. An emotional response takes about 90 seconds to complete if allowed to proceed unimpeded. There is research about this, and I desperately need to find it again. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. It's fascinating. This means we don't object, we don't berate, we just allow the feelings to take over for about a minute and a half until our chemical process completes and we start to feel somewhat normal again. The thing with disappointment is that we, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to bury it or hide it. It's embarrassing. We can feel ungrateful or foolish for being disappointed. We can even feel shame for being disappointed. When we decide not to face the disappointment head on, we are giving ourselves a new seed to plant in the garden of our undealt with emotions. Unfortunately, while this may have started as disappointment, it could grow into rage if we ignore it. Please don't let it grow into rage. Rage comes from an equation that says, you stole something from me and you owe it to me. The longer we feel like something is owed to us, in the case of disappointment, that thing that is owed to us could simply be our over-hopeful expectation that we had dreamed up. The more that little thing begins to glom on to other sources of anger and disappointment, it creates an incredibly, inexplicably, powerfully strong rage. Dealing with it when it is still harmless and can be traced to an immediate source will prevent it from becoming rage with the potential to do great relational harm. Lastly, understand that disappointment doesn't have to be rational. Hopes are rarely ever rational. So it follows that disappointment, because a hope is not realized, is not rational either. Having irrational feelings doesn't make you irrational or a failure. Know this and learn to love yourself for the quirks of your sometimes inexplicable reactions. Have a little ongoing dialogue with yourself in which you whisper your admiration for the courage it takes to feel your feelings. Now, in the long term, sure, we could decide that we won't ever be hopeful again and that this will prevent us from being disappointed. But I think we can all agree that hopefulness feels pretty darn good, and it can be a fantastic vector for joy, even in the face of the joy to disappointment ratio. So the first long-term suggestion I would like to make is that you start to increase your baseline satisfaction quota. To do this, I would suggest the simple act of articulating the good moments. Yes, this is kind of like me telling you, just be more mindful and you will be more content. But there is legitimate benefit in not just thinking, actually saying out loud when something is going well. The more we notice things that are going well, the more we are adding tiny little beads of joy onto the scale of our lives. Eventually, with enough of these, the scale can begin tipping to the side of joy. When we are starting from a place of more satisfaction, we have less distance to drop when we're facing disappointment. And let's be honest, it's that whiplash between joy and disappointment that is a killer. We also need to increase our lucidity over the long term. This means keeping realistic expectations. It means setting expectations for ourselves and for other people. This is particularly important when dealing with relationships. Trust issues can develop out of relational disappointment, and lucidity will help us not rely on people in ways that they are not equipped to be relied on in. Next, develop a habit of remembering. Whether it is your daily ideal life exercise, or remembering what is working, what isn't working, or in the format of a daily gratitude journal, or like a friend of mine set a resolution last year to do a daily social media post of something good that happened that day. Make a habit of remembering. And lastly, this will come as no surprise to you, Cinderella. I want you to take the time to intentionally celebrate your little successes. Whether it is just a cup of tea in which you toast to yourself, or like I did 1 year ago this week, start a podcast. Celebrations come in all shapes and sizes, but they mark your successes in indelible ink in our hearts, like a little tattoo. Now, I feel like I need to include this too. As with everything we talked about here, it ends up being about the golden rule. But when you are feeling disappointed, what is the worst possible thing a person could say? I can actually think of a lot of them, but one of the worst is that someone minimize my experience of my disappointment. Oh, it's not so bad, they might say, or they might become toxically positive or provide false hope. Or they could just try to change the subject and ignore my disappointment because they are uncomfortable with my feelings. So, if these are the worst possible reactions, what are the best? I have to credit my favorite death doula and your wicked stepsister, Lila Kelly, for introducing me to the idea of holding space. This means a person is present and actively listening, but does not try to influence you or your feelings. They just keep the world at bay while you work through your feelings and your thoughts. They listen if you need to be listened to. They make you a cup of coffee if you need a cup of coffee. They aren't going to try to rush you through your disappointment. If this is what I would want done for me when I'm feeling disappointed, then I need to purpose to provide this when someone I love is feeling disappointed. Provide a safe space, ask open-ended questions, and just be cool. Get my feelings out of the way and be a safe person for my disappointed loved one. Try this and let me know how it goes for you. I had to do it this morning at 5:20 a.m. with my eldest child, who is disappointed that our holidays are over. Let me tell you, that is not an hour of the day that I am at my best when it comes to holding space. But it truly was a magical experience for both of us. He felt listened to and cared for. I didn't try to rush him through it just to get him back to sleep. Holding space is magical for building connection with the people we love who are facing disappointment. This actually meets up with my New Year's resolution for 2023, which is to live out the golden rule in every single aspect of my life. So I will be sharing with you throughout the year different ways that I have tried to do that. I'm going to do it in a segment I like to call the Golden Rule Rules. All right. As I continue doing my ideal life exercise, I want you to as well. Please remember the 4 questions. What is working? What isn't working? What do I need to think about? What do I need to do? Think about how the golden rule can apply to those things. I want you also to think about how you can do for someone else what you would want done for you. Do you have an example? I'd love to hear it. Don't forget to drop me a line, lily@singwithyourfeet.com, or by direct message on Instagram. All right. Being disappointed comes with being human, Cinderella. We were doted with imagination and desires, and because nothing on this green earth will ever be perfect, even those things we imagine and desire can fall short. How we handle our disappointment can help us understand ourselves better, and understanding ourselves is a stepping stone to loving ourselves better. If we really want to love others as we love ourselves, then loving ourselves well is the most important thing we can do. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Please remember to rate and review the podcast on your podcatcher and to share it if you think it could help someone. Also, don't forget to drop me a line if you might be able to meet somewhere between Chicago and Cleveland in July. A great big thank you to Seven Productions here in Mulhouse, France, for the use of the song La Joie as the intro and outro of the show. Thank you to Matt Kugler, who can be found on Instagram as Matt-K, who sang our theme song, and to Claude Ekwe, who wrote it. This is your fairy godmother signing off. Just remember, it is never too late to start singing with your feet.